it is so nice to see all of you here on this Friday afternoon, so late in the fall semester. I think it says a lot about how excited we are about Dr. Shohet's talk today. So it is with the greatest pleasure that I introduce all of you to Dr. Merav Shohet here for the second Nelson Lecture on Southeast Asia of this academic year. Dr. Shohet is a cultural anthropologist who specializes in psychological, medical, and linguistic anthropology. She received a BA degree, I think an AB degree officially, in social studies from Harvard University, and then an MA and a PhD degree from UCLA in anthropology. She is currently an assistant professor, if I'm not mistaken, at Boston University in the Department of Anthropology. Her ethnographic research focuses on topics such as affect, morality, and health. In Vietnam, North America, and most recently Israel-Palestine, her studies of care and gendered subjectivities illuminate how communicative practices and also the social, historical, and political economic transformations of which they are a part mediate individuals' experiences of moral personhood and lived possibilities in context of caregiving, suffering, and recovery. Currently drawing on her longer-standing interest in narrative ethics and inequalities, Dr. Shohet most recently began working on aging and end-of-life care in changing urban communities, as well as on the pandemic's harmful syndemic effects on racialized end-stage kidney disease patients in the greater Boston area, where she documents chronic terminal patients' struggle to flourish. And I've had the good fortune of seeing her present on this topic over the summer when she agreed to be a part of a panel that some colleagues and I organized, and it is absolutely fantastic, and I look forward to seeing this research published in the near future. For today, however, we are going to return to Dr. Shohet's earlier research. So in her talk today, therefore, she will be discussing her first book, which we see up here, and I have a copy for those of you who want to read through it, Silence and Sacrifice, Family Stories of Care and the Limits of Love in Vietnam. This book draws on person-centered and family-centered, I should say, topics and language socialization research among multi-generational families to theorize how sacrifice works as a complex meta-value guiding everyday moral practice. Here, affirmations of love and silence-filled stories of intimacy and care entrench hierarchies and asymmetrical reciprocity, working to minimize overt conflict and provide a sense of continuity in Vietnam's rapidly urbanizing late socialist context. Now, for those of you who haven't read it yet, I really and absolutely highly recommend that you do so. I have to say, among all the things I could say about this, but I'm going to leave that to you, one of the many things that stood out is sort of this book's lucid and very careful, kind, and theoretically engaging and innovative writing style. To me, at least, this book stands out as an example of the very best that anthropology has to offer. So, if you have the time, I highly suggest this. Thank you very much for joining us today, Merav.
Thank you so much. I'm really humbled. Thank you, Sylvia, for such a nice introduction. I'm also just really honored to be here and to have a chance to share some of my work with all of you today. This is actually my first book talk in person, and I feel like I've still not mastered this genre. I'll try not to bore you to death. I will make a little shout out to one of the other research projects that I'm doing. I wanted to especially thank Dr. Sylvia Tidy for organizing this and for inviting me. Also to give a shout out to Brian for doing so much of the behind the scenes work, to Jim for taking me out to lunch and also making this possible, and of course the Department of Anthropology and the East Asia Center Nelson Lectures for sponsoring this. And I'm really especially looking forward to being in conversation with all of you and really to taking questions at any time. So I guess I'll jump right in, and I have essentially one key takeaway for today, which is to de-romanticize care and community, but also not to give up on these as an aspiration for a more just world in the face of violence, illness, and inequity. And I think that we can do this, first of all, by acknowledging how we are connected and entangled and obligated to others at multiple scales. This is an existential condition, inseparable from our being in this world. My focus will mostly be on the microdynamics of entanglement, but I invite us to think beyond the local case that I present. And I guess I'll first of all be taking the liberty of a little detour, like I said, to talk about another project I began in the wake of the pandemic, in the midst of putting the final touches on silence and sacrifice. In 2020, depressed by Trumpism and the worst of the pandemic and pervasive, seemingly intractable inequalities and inequities in the US and beyond, I'm sure I wasn't alone in wishing to study and find new ways of imagining and enacting care in our communities. My small way of doing this kind of in the research front was to collaborate with a nephrologist, Dr. Inza Schmidt of Boston Medical Center, to research how stigmatized and racialized end-stage kidney disease patients in one of Boston's safety net hospitals were syndemically affected, meaning exponentially harmed by the pandemic, in conjunction with their already structurally precarious positions. And one of the things that captivated me as we continued to do the research was that many of the patients, they really talked about experiencing the pandemic not so much as a rupture, but as a continuity. Caring for and being cared by kin and friends, some found ways not only to make life bearable, but also to flourish. They seem to do so by prioritizing contact and connections with their social networks, especially intimate kin and friends, sometimes somewhat at the expense of public health guidelines. And as well, they narratively privileged chronicity of their condition over its looming terminality, to find constancy, solace, and hope in their faith in God and church communities on this earth and in the afterlife. And this in no way alleviated the exacerbated structural conditions that continue to assault racialized patients, but it points to the ways in which community and a sense of continuity can matter quite a bit in times of crisis and in the face of chronic trouble. Of course, since I was invited to talk about my research in Southeast Asia today, I'll stop blathering about this new project, and instead I'll now take us to Vietnam. And so here I want to highlight how care emerges as a central facet of life there, while also inviting us to think about how this applies here in places like Charlottesville and Boston and elsewhere. Long before the pandemic, in the mid-2000s, I came to Vietnam to try to understand how families had been, who had been split up since the 1950s by the nation's anti-colonial and anti-imperial wars and by Vietnam's Civil War, came to reunite since the 1980s and make life together possible. I situated the study in central Vietnam as a site of conflict and rapid social change. As you might know, within 2 decades of reunification, communist Vietnam embraced a series of reforms known as Doi Mai that increasingly marketized and liberalized its economy. By 2007, Vietnam had adopted market socialism and entered the World Trade Organization. So I finally turned now to my recent book, Silence and Sacrifice, to expose some of the complexities of care, love, and community, and how these sometimes involve a range of betrayals. I'll begin by briefly introducing the structure and some of the basic concepts of my book, and follow with some excerpts from Chapter 4. The first 3 chapters illustrate 3 basic principles that I'm working with: sacrifice, asymmetrical reciprocity, and Pektan. These work like the grammar of a language in a sense to structure and organize the life experiences of the people I worked with, but of course in non-uniform ways. And then the second part of the book continues to emphasize complications on the ground, as I feature protagonists who had more tenuous connections to the state and ghosts from the past haunting them at times. Together, all these chapters show that ethical personhood is relational and contextual. we have to take account of someone's gender, life course, class, and national politics to understand them. And we can't simply talk about the ethical person or moral communities in general. My research was mostly based in the bustling city in central Vietnam, in Da Nang, and its neighboring rural province of Quang Nam between 2002 and 2008. It involved deep immersion in the lives of several related and unrelated families in the city, its urbanizing periphery, and nearby villages. My methods included participant observation, household surveys, focal follows, and person-centered interviews, and this led to what I've come to call a family-centered ethnography, documented with regular video recordings, photos, notes, all the usual stuff of anthropology. And a family-centered ethnography means shifting the unit of analysis from an individual or group of individuals who are treated as reasonably uniform compared to other sociological groups and in relation to others, to examining the knots and the entanglements of kin who choose and don't choose to be in each other's lives. This involved following the family members across all events, from celebrations and funerals to village festivals, weddings, and daily life, such as going to the market and child rearing. It also meant following public health and morality campaigns and related propaganda. I didn't originally mean to study silence and sacrifice, but in trying to understand what holds families together who had been torn by wars and all the subsequent changes in Vietnam, I came to see these as key components. I constantly read about or heard invoked the concept of Hy Sinh and Thanh Cam when learning Vietnamese and talking to people, whereas people never talked about trauma. And so because I didn't want to impose my own concepts or to pry into their lives too much, I decided to focus on the role of Hy Sinh and Thanh Cam in people's lives as a way in, and also to answer another question, which is, what does it mean to be a virtuous person in times of upheaval and change? In Vietnam's Dai Mai, or innovation market economy, where nationalized forms of care are increasingly absent, I found that young and especially poor women, and in Da Nang, those affiliated with the losing side of the American war, shoulder a disproportionate burden. This is because market forces reify gendered cultural norms to saddle them with a work of care. And this involves a third key concept, asymmetrical reciprocity. This is an edict term that I developed to make sense of the relations of care and forms of exchange that I continually observed in the field, and which I later thought also apply right here in America, but in more muted ways. It has to do with how people are always in relations of obligation with each other in rather Mausian ways. And it's crystallized in the common Vietnamese saying that people must respect those above and yield to those below them. Kin Tan Yin Yu. Throughout the book, I show how these are gendered, but not just differentiated in terms of men sacrificing and women loving and caring, as we might be used to thinking in so-called Western terms. In anthropology, we've tended to theorize sacrifice as a blood-filled religious ritual, which in Vietnam, Hy Sinh is not, or in Vietnamese it's not, or as a patriotic act, which Hy Sinh very much is in Vietnam. But what we've ignored in our theories are the seemingly mundane and personal forms of sacrifice in daily life. In chapter 1 of my book, I expand on the different scales of sacrifice, from patriotic death to suffering to sustain the home front during the war, to the ways that these are entangled with personal suffering, silence, and sacrifice. I recount in that chapter the case of a man from Quang Nam who was imprisoned and tortured by the French prior to Vietnam's split, and then spent years fighting to liberate the South. For decades, and on the slide I have some of the quotes from his experiences being imprisoned by the French, which very much sound like waterboarding. So for decades, he was separated from his natal family. Soon after marrying a wife in the north, he was recruited to join the war front in his natal province in the south, leaving her pregnant and alone for over a decade. I trace in the chapter how Than's narrative aligns with Vietnam's broader national history, seemingly mimicking the propagandistic slogans of the times that Vietnam is one and that nothing is more valuable than freedom and independence. Yet the slogans also have deep meanings for Thanh the soldier, fearing for his life and missing his mother and wife. As the story unfolds, we see how Thanh minimizes his own past suffering and instead highlights his wife's and especially his mother's pain. This is part of the silence of sacrifice. People use silence not just as a passive failure to speak, but also as a mode of indexing their own virtue and endurance by being there and affirming their obligations to others. The next two chapters show how asymmetrical reciprocity at Thanh Cam work as organizing principles of life. These structure people's experiences of time across Vietnam's two calendars and their relations with the ancestors, with the state, and with each other. Among other things, I show how communist state efforts to legislate gender equality have worked instead to engender difference by naturalizing gender, class, and other hierarchies. These rely on unequal, but presumably benevolent, bidirectional care. So we have, for example, labor laws that mandate earlier retirement for women, the outlawing of polygamy and child marriage, and readily available abortion for married couples to produce the desired kind of high-quality population that the communist and now the market-oriented socialist state desires. The second half of my book, and what I want to shift to now, troubles principles of morality and ethics, care, sacrifice, and asymmetrical reciprocity when we study them in practice. Here, it's important to look at families in terms of multiple members and their different, dynamic, intersectional perspectives and grievances. And this is where we see how Thanh Cam gets weaponized as kin moralize and criticize one another, and more silently, the state, but I won't get to that today, that's in chapter 5. To make concrete what I mean by the weaponization of care, not just by humanitarian state efforts, but by intimates themselves, I'd like now to turn to excerpts from chapter 4 of my book, Waiting as Care. First, though, I highlight 3 other concepts that will be useful in making sense of the stories I tell. These are 3 genres of framings of narrative: foreshadowing, backshadowing, and sideshadowing narratives. By narrative, I mean stories of various kinds, not just those confined to written texts. Narratives are embodied and come alive in the messiness of interaction. You're probably all familiar with foreshadowing narratives, where we see past events as foretelling future ones. These are typically found in narratives of progress and modernity, which rely on the standard literary device of foreshadowing, where writers plant omens to key us to future happenings. So like when we say it was a dark and stormy night and we know that something bad's gonna happen, or the typical trope of manifest destiny in the US of let's go westward, or in Vietnam, conquering the South. Backshadowing narratives operate by the same reverse logic. We judge past actions in terms of the present, as though those conditions already were and should have been known in the past. So for example, people blame Holocaust victims for not having seen the writings on the wall. Both foreshadowing and backshadowing narrative practices rely on linear, morally consistent plots. By contrast, sideshadowing narratives are those that highlight contingency, ambiguity, and contradiction. They're not so linear, and instead can foreground the doubt, uncertainty, and ambivalence of people's lived experience. We can find all 3 narrative practices in people's lives, but in different contexts and degrees. And so let me now show how this plays out in the lives of Vietnamese families as they continually had to navigate present concerns with health and wealth, colored both by the long shadows of wartime, when their loyalties were split, and the present transition to market socialism, or do I lie? What I want to show here are some of the impossibilities of privatization, even under neoliberalism, using a linguistic, anthropological, and critical phenomenological lens to highlight the micro instances of care. I focus on the moral rather than political ecology of marketizing socialist Vietnam to show some of the ambivalences and complexities involved in care, and how there is no safe haven where all is always good and right. This leads me to bridge a debate in the anthropology of ethics and morality on whether ethics is primarily an immanent ordinary practice, or if it requires a moment of breakdown that forces us to stop and reflect and only then act to remake our world. I'm sorry, I'm just completely blinded by the sun. So I'm like constantly moving here. I can't see. Okay, so I begin, I begin with two premises. First, in focusing on individuals who care, I assume not the rightfully maligned, autonomous, bounded, self-interested persons that theorists attribute to Western or even neoliberal subjects, but relational and evaluative subjects whose ethics come to the foreground when we attend to their living narratives of everyday interactions. These narratives are not texting. They unfold as people talk and interact with one another in their daily life. Family caregivers' attempts to provide care or show can be fraught with moral peril and filled with ambivalent silences that threaten to unravel relations in later home Vietnam. Any harmony, continuity, or even what we might consider the ordinary do not come ready-made. They're effortfully achieved and precariously sustained. My second assumption is that end-of-life care requires competence. Caregivers try to keep the dying both alive and comfortable. And yet competence or incompetence is at once imminent, since we become competent or incompetent at any moment. It's impending. And competence is also imminent. It's inherent in any social interaction. Throughout fieldwork, I was trying to tease out what it means to act as and to be a competent ethical person in the land. In chapter 2 of my book, I relate seemingly simple politeness routines to ancestral worship rituals. As I discovered with child-rearing and language socialization, routine acts and rituals subjectivate or teach children and adults to embody a morality of sacrifice at the camp. In other words, in learning language, children learn how to act, feel, and be Vietnamese. In this video that I'll show in a second, we see how the mother is insisting that the toddler perform respect to the neighbors, and she corrects her daughter pretty forcefully with her hands and words, but also in a very gentle, yielding manner. So I'll play this. Okay, so she's telling the neighbor, say goodbye to him, but say it with respect. And he's also modeling for her how to do it. And she immediately complies, and the mom tells her, okay, now turn around and say it to his wife, who's standing next to me with a camera. But she bows too low, and the mom is telling her, do it again. So it matters, right? And then she bows too low, and so the mom corrects her again and forces her to do it the right way, which is like this, and not all the way down. And then she tells her to also tell goodbye to the 5-year-old, but the 5-year-old doesn't deserve a bow at all, so she tells her just say bye-bye. And here she's exaggerating completely, but isn't corrected for that because it's not seen as significant. And then we see her also again doing the flourish with a kiss to her. And then her boy cousin, who can't walk, isn't really expected to do it competently. I can show this again just for fun. So he's getting her attention and tells her how to do it. And this girl was sassy as all heck, so it was really fun. Okay, so she's telling her, stand up and do it again. could say that she was performing for the camera, except that even when my camera broke and I was doing the same kinds of visits, she continued being the same kind of behavior. So I don't think it was just the camera. Okay. So one thing to also notice here is how the mother, daughter, and neighbors internalize or socialize into being constantly surrounded by a watchful audience that judges them as moral beings, holding them accountable to pay respect above, but also to yield to those below. And this is part of being sacrificing beings in their community, and later translates to the similar forms of corporeal sacrifice to the ancestors, holding all of these rituals. And so this is also true at the end of life. Acts are never unitary or private. They involve a range of asymmetrical forms of reciprocity that reinforce hierarchies. I'll focus on just one instance and the stories that surround it. Note that unlike in North America, where care is highly technologized and takes place mostly in biomedical settings, in Da Nang, care was mostly given at home, provided by kin in the midst of their other ritual and income-earning activities. I learned this from the case of 75-year-old Babai, who started complaining quietly to me of headaches in April and suffered a minor stroke in July. After weeks in the hospital, she returned home and suffered another stroke that left her in a permanent vegetative state in a coma. Waiting for Ba to die at some unknown time in the future, her family shrouded the calamity in silence. Ba's husband, Ambai, coped by sleeping a lot and saying little. The family's women stepped in to fill the vacuum, managing loss with material acts of caregiving. Bass spent several months hooked up to machines in the hospital, but in the face of mounting costs, she returned home in December. She lay on a bed placed in the living room, tended by her daughters and daughters-in-law. So in other words, right in the midst of social life, not hidden away in the bedroom or in the hospital. And what I'm going to show might be a bit painful to watch, and I have to admit that I was at first very uncomfortable documenting this visually, but the family actually chided me. They're like, why are you not filming this? Why are you not taking photographs? So I finally did, although somewhat limited. And that speaks again about my own ethnocentric biases about how do we deal with pain and illness and death. So from just a minute of footage I filmed in January, about a month after Ba had returned home, we can see a drama unfold that illustrates how kin display their care for the dying. In waiting and caring, they apprentice ethical personhood. This emergent moral socialization routine begins with Ba lying in bed in the living room, her knees locked upright. Her daughter-in-law, Lan, pleads with a comatose elder to straighten out her legs. Who's come to watch, uses the non-differential second personal pronoun me, which only status seniors use to our status juniors, to establish hierarchy as he calls out to Lan till she looks up at him, only to tell her to get Ba to straighten out her legs. With a smile, Lan answers in a plaintive voice. She keeps grimacing. She then adds, this morning I was able to stretch her a bit, but she's really struggling. Doesn't matter, reassures. But Lan continues with her complaint. Actually, she's mad at me. I'm hurting her terribly. Approaching the bed, mutters down, it turns, and then gazes at his wife as Lan continues to walk on Ba's legs. Bending over to clearly address Ba, states in an authoritative voice that you just see here, in a paternalistic voice, doesn't hurt, I'm down. Bending even closer, he exhorts Ba in a scolding voice, endure the pain, stretch out the legs, why stay cramped up? His eyes focusing on Ba, he then adds in a gentler, quieter voice, raising and lowering his chin in a kind of entreaty, stretch out, stretch out. Throughout, Lan continues to gently press on her mother-in-law's legs, working to make Ba cooperate with Am's command. She overlaps with him, protesting quietly, I tried doing that, while Am's sister-in-law adds her own directive, stretch out her legs, let her legs lie on the bed. So I'll go back and show that. And in the background, we hear the women preparing the ancestor worship meal and actually kind of grumbling about why are they still doing this ritual when there's somebody ill in the house. So see, he's looking at her, and he does to scold her, but then he does this. Okay. So adopting Goffman's model of participant roles, we see how the two generations organize their interaction in gendered and age-graded ways. It's a daughter-in-law, Lan, who physically takes care of the ill woman, Dad, while the seniors direct her to keep doing what she has, in fact, been attempting to do. Lan, in turn, has little recourse than to smile, comply, and only weakly protest that she has been doing as told. We learn even more about responsibility, morality, and power if we consider the ecology of this micro-interaction. This includes participants' eye gaze, movements, and bodily use of space, which reveal who is interpolated as a ratified participant and how. From this perspective, the exchange looks less harsh. It exemplifies acts of care. Despite Baz's grave condition, her incompetent caregivers treat her as a ratified participant. She is someone to whom they attribute a will, emotions, and agency. Scolds, Lan pleads, and imagines her experiences being scolded. In contrast with those who are not there daily to attend to Baz, they at times address her directly, not just as a mostly but not yet dead body. In Schutz's sense, they enact a we relationship with Baz. They treat her not as a soon-to-be predecessor, someone who shares neither the same temporal or spatial frame with them, but as a consociate, someone with whom they could still grow older together. They know that Beth cannot respond either verbally or with her body. Yet and Lan read her knotted brow and stiff limbs as expressions of pain and stubborn reproof. They treat her, in other words, as still endowed with a rich cognitive life, even though she is motionless, essentially unresponsive, and on the verge of death. They care. In this incipient narrative, Am's exhortations to stretch out models for Lan how to act in a difficult and morally fraught instance, where the daughter-in-law is afraid to hurt and earn the wrath of her mother-in-law. In addressing Beth, indirectly encourages Lan to keep on tending the old woman, not to allow Baz's limbs to stiffen and suffer even more. This is an interpersonal form of care that does not explicitly implicate the market. Though privately done at home in passing, without much time for reflection, it's a public act that demands recognition and repetition. And yet Lan and were not professional end-of-life caregivers. They struggled to make Beth comfortable and to manage their own discomfort. Most days they did so in muted ways, Lan smiling and sleeping in the face of Baz's calamity. In the absence of prescribed rituals which are in place for tending and honoring the dead, they worked instead at treating with respect and care this matriarch who for so long had herself managed the smooth running of the household. They interpolated not just each other, but also the comatose Baz as capable of moral action, as eminently competent and yet eminently incompetent beings who are engaged in an ethical project of care for and about one another. This is why the interaction seems so fraught, I think. We see unequally positioned family members deliberate through fleeting action over what the best good is, in Cheryl Mattingly's terms, for the nearly dead. They seem to act in unison, in agreement that even though stretching out Baz's legs causes the inert or recalcitrant body and the person inhabiting it pain, because she is still a living person, they have to enjoin Baz to endure pain and act ethically in this world. And yet this version of care and ethical personhood was precarious. Performed daily in Baz's house till her eventual death in spring 2008, it enlisted a range of Baz's relatives, who visited periodically and spoke to and about her. As they continued to participate in the household's rituals, no one projected back into the future as an ancestor, and no one mentioned her imminent death. They oriented to her only as present and suffering somewhat indignantly. Silence, again, was not an omission but an active, pervasive presence. I could end by concluding that these occasions, like Dad's earlier quiet endurance of pain, where for months she did not seek care for her high blood pressure, reflect local understandings of gendered virtuous care and daily sacrifice, demanded by an economy of retracting state care. But the story does not end here. Not everyone regarded Am as innocent victims. Am niece Anne, for example, surprised me one December day in a story of past wrongs and transgressions. I briefly retell this story in the imminent critique that Dad's current state led Anne to project, both to show how protagonists are not all equally burdened with the ethical work of enduring suffering for the sake of another silently, and how fragile love and care can be under both marketization and socialism. Decades earlier, Am's brothers fought on opposing sides of the American War, and yet the siblings always seemed tight-knit. They kept past divisions mute. They liked to recount how Am had done right by his younger brother Sin, raising him and ensuring his education since their father died young in 1948. These were compact, coherence-striving narratives with clear beginnings and morally predictable endings. But there is another side-shadowing genre of narratives. These stories highlight ambiguity, ambivalence, and contradiction. Co-narrated and nonlinear, they invite moral reflection and debate. In Anne's meandering story, Am and his wife appear as withholding or suspending care during and after the war. Anne narrates this tale of wrongs indirectly. It's a side-shadowing story told non-linearly by weaving back and forth through time, emphasizing moments of connection, love, and hurt. And I present a kinship chart just because I'm using so many different names. And so what we have here is the oldest generation who are dead, colored in red, and then and Babai, who are both alive and the oldest of this household, and then B, who is his sister, who is being narrated and eventually comes into telling the story, and the youngest brother, Sin, and his wife, Ma, who died. But we'll hear that story. So in Anne's, so it's from Anne's perspective initially, that Am and Ba had not risked losing their house for sheltering her American collaborating brother Sin, nor had they helped his faithful wife Ma visit him in a communist re-education camp, like Am's sister and Anne's mother B had done. Am and Ba's passive acts of omission of care, which remained implicit and unnarrated, also turned into sinful commission when Am sold off lands that jointly belonged to all his siblings. He left Sin's children nothing. The threads of the story are tangled, narrating shifting affective stances, oblique connections, and disagreements that are not resolved. In side-shadowing fashion, Anne presents a series of contested moral stances as protagonists hold conflicting commitments to their kin. She grieves for the now-deceased Uncle Sin's wife, Ma, who died after the couple left Vietnam. But when Anne was upset at Sin for remarrying, her mother B defended him and scolded Anne. Blood ties, loyalty to Sin, trump friendship and connection with Ma. Anne's story continually descends into the past and navigates a present seemingly blindly, without the clarity of hindsight. It relies on silences and absences, not saying that Am had not cared for his brother, but pointing how his sister had. She tells me, siblings love, take care of each other. They don't care about whatever happens. They don't care about money. And yet Anne's story is filled with instances in which gifts of money stood for acts of love, and refusal to give was equated with betrayal. Contradiction pervades our stories, and still, one point emerges clearly at the end, when Anne's mother Bee takes over the telling. Land prices soared, but and his wife barely shared profits from the sale of their grandparents' land, and refused her even the smallest of loans. They didn't care. Here, Bee and Anne use backshadowing, using the present hindsight to morally assess past deeds, to link Baz's present state to recent and past wrongs. Their story, which gained steam only slowly, suddenly crescendoed to its conclusion. The present suffering was karmic retribution for a life that could have been led otherwise. Her voice quietly furious, Bee says, "I only asked for $20. I asked for so little, but he didn't give it. This was recent, before Babai got sick. Said he didn't have it. Fuck. We yield to him whatever he wants." Mother and daughter abruptly stopped their count with Bee's unexpected curse. Resentments over care withheld or inadequately performed, which could lie dormant for decades, came to the surface with Baz's present illness. This occasioned imminent reflection over how to care, and imminent judgments about who is competent or incompetent at doing so. Tension subtly expressed in instances such as when Baz's legs need to be straightened, incite caregivers to reflect on who has cared and who deserves caring. A linguistic phenomenological lens reveals how temporal horizons reach into the past and future, both in Anne and Bee's backshadowing and side-shadowing stories that frame past expectations and promises unfulfilled as foregone conclusions or as unexpected turns. In Lan and Am's incipient and active narratives, ethical figures take shape through complaints, exhortations, and silences. These stories and silences color present concerns over care, condense in Baz's figure lying on her bed in the living room, unconscious and unrestful. These not only sustain, but also threaten to rupture shared understandings of who is or was virtuous and why, forcing and forging an ethics not of cool judgment, but rife with cascading efforts of love and regret. These emotions, I want to emphasize, are spawned in intersubjective relations and pervade ethics. And still, rupture was kept at bay. Anne and Bee continued to visit Beth, effectively refusing to jeopardize rituals of care and dominant narratives of virtue, despite some tensions. Their stories where scornful language erupts remain almost exclusively silenced. I conclude then that by tracing the unfolding implotments and intersections of Anne's, Anne's, and Bee's stories, we can witness how precarious the work of enduring in the name of love and care is, and how quotidian sacrifice remains for the most part, silence in speech, but demonstrated in action. Competence and incompetence are simultaneously immanent and imminent in social life, bringing into relief the moral economy and politics of care at home, where market constraints form a mostly silenced but not invisible template for what actions seem possible and desirable. Here, privatization is not an option. Life is social and fraught to the core. In the rest of the book, I continue to show how participants navigate these sorts of dilemmas and conflicts, sometimes choosing silence, other times gossip, to make claims of one another in an ethically fraught relational world. Again and again, we can see cultural patterns through attention to the minutiae of language and interaction, which color and even constitute the ways in which families and communities struggle to cohere. And these reveal yet again the old feminist insight that public ethics are to be found in the after all not so private domain of families' always already political home lives. Contrary to those who want to see ethics as a transcendent domain beyond the ordinary, I insist that it's in the immanent and imminent knots of mundane life that ethics appear and are walked out. The conclusion of my book, Mourning and Silent Sacrifice, reflects on the death and funeral preparations of another family, where we see how the bereaved attempt to contain their grief. Here, too, I argue that repetition, like change, doesn't always beget futurity or natality in Hannah Arendt's terms, even in Beethoven. or he signals life and suffering in silence for the sake of love. Not all places insist, as people tend to do in Vietnam, that sacrifice ought to be viewed and secretive. Silence here becomes salient as a present absence of speech, not unlike how bad was a present absence and sin was an absent presence, both signaling forms of love and betrayal. And in Ba's case, as she was nearing death, she became almost but not quite like the ancestors whose altar continually reminds us of their silent presence, as they exist palpably for their worshippers. Family-centered ethnographies and attention to side-chattering narratives, I think, help us to understand community dynamics from the bottom up, with their many conflicts and contradictions. In witnessing the open-endedness and ambiguity over which family configuration, ethical aspiration, or set of perspectives to privilege, and asking who really is a virtuous victim or moral pawn, who belongs in a family or community and on what grounds, for whom relatives or institutions are responsible and in what ways, we can initiate similar discussions at the larger scale levels of public institutions, such as medicine, law, and public welfare, that overlap with, but don't fully encompass, family relationships. In the U.S., calls for freedom often imply a liberal negative type of freedom, premised on monadic, bounded, autonomous individuals who insist on freedom to neglect and abandon and cut off connections. But relationships and obligations are in fact inseparable and need not be inherently experienced as coercive and harmful, though they often can be unevenly and inequitably distributed, such that the ideal of asymmetrical reciprocity in practice and at larger scales can easily slip into relations of exploitation and subjugation. Still, stasis in present relations is not inevitable, but simulated and achieved. Our American historical baggage of racism, disenfranchisement, and liberal conceptualizations of personhood, as Marx stated long ago, and many followers, of course, have shown, leaves far too many community members vulnerable, dehumanized, and subject to social death. I've yet to see an all-encompassing solution, nor do I have the hubris to think that I can formulate it. And so the challenge still remains for us to imagine and forge a better world in which care, in its asymmetrically reciprocal and everyday sacrificial forms, might yet be an intersubjective force of good, and sadly, sometimes and for some, also of harm. And so on the train here, I was actually reading Jared Zigan's piece, How Is It Between Us? And I guess my book is a way of continuing that conversation, because I share his view that this question is really the groundwork for ethics, since we are fundamentally social and relational and always and mutually, as I show in Vietnam, in asymmetrically reciprocal relations with others, human and of course beyond human. But, and I think that Sylvia's work, for example, and China's work, and Liz and many others actually show this quite beautifully. But I disagree somewhat with Jared's formulation on 2 points. And one is that I don't see ordinary ethics as opposed to relational ethics, because I read that body of work a lot more generously. And that I think that what they're striving, their view of the person in ethics is not so proceduralist as he suggests, but actually, or that it's invested in translating the other into the self-same, but actually precisely striving at this relationality and in the ways that we're always exceeding and exceeded by our relations with others. And that the pre-established rules and principles fail us when we describe situations as decontextualized. And that's why we need the ethnography, really, to actually look at where there's agreement and disagreement, and to adopt a both and rather than an either or approach that so many of the people engaged in the ethics debate tend to do. And then my second critique is just that the relationality that he presents, I think, remains a bit too flat and sterile, and that we also have to ask what happens when people find themselves embedded, as they usually are, within knots of relationships, where they're always mutually obligated to multiple beings who make conflicting and incommensurable demands. And so we need to expand that lens far beyond that dyadic relationship to always having also at least a third. And I think that that's where it's helpful to pay attention to narrative as well as to asymmetrical reciprocity, and to look at those frames of foreshadowing, backshadowing, side-shadowing, and all of their possible permutations. Since these help us understand the thickness and complexity of experience at the phenomenological level, always in relation with others, including one's own multiple selves housed within one singular body. And so to this end, I think we need to reiterate the view of language that I advocate here, which is not referential or representational, as if the world simply exists here for us to grasp. But when we take a fundamentally constitutive view of language, where it is at all times entwined with and exceeded by an exceeding experience, then indeed it makes sense to do what Jared invites us to do and see it in the Heideggerian view of language as the house of being. But I see house and home as not necessarily signifying a place of safety or freedom or care, as if these are straightforward. Since in our social entanglements, these are fraught and ephemeral in addition to enduring, transcendent, and all the rest. And that's why I think that it's through attuned ethnography, which is what I try to do, maybe sometimes unsuccessfully, but where we listen to the multiple silences of narrative and experience, so we begin always incompletely to apprehend life of ourselves in and with others. Thank you. So I'd be really happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much for that beautiful talk. I wanted to try to link up the sort of opening discussion of method with your conclusions around silence to try to think about whether this pursuit of this family-centered ethnography, which I really like as a method that you're bringing into this, might be particularly well suited to studying silences and how that played out in your work and your awareness of where silences were happening.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think so, and I think the other thing I mentioned too, I failed to mention at the end, is that also when I talk about family, I don't just mean that kind of old ethnocentric view as blood and marriage that Schneider, of course, critiqued long ago, and that the ART literature has done a lot to expand for us. But yeah, that I think this is part of kind of expanding our unit of analysis, because I think we tend to study groups as kind of too as if everybody is the same. And it's not to mean that we're all individual snowflakes, right? Like, of course we're constrained by structural relations. Of course we have patterns. But that part of this kind of methodology that in some ways came a bit by accident, but it's in the very act of trying to understand family life that I was listening to multiple people's perspectives, and so you hear one story and it's great, and then it's not completely undone, but it's partially undone by somebody else. And I think that that's part of taking silence also seriously, to listen to the gaps, and at the same time not to fetishize silence. And I think that that's where linguistic anthropology also is really helpful a lot of times, because I think cultural anthropologists, psychological anthropologists sometimes treat it as a kind of black box, as if it's this, oh, the silence, and we can't get it. And of course we can't get into other people's minds, right? And in some ways we know things mostly by what people say, but I think we also know things by how people say what they say, and we can pay attention to what do people not say, and what are they conveying with their body and with their pacing and with all of these paralinguistic terms. That I think we have some methods to combine instead of staying in our siloed subdisciplines to really speak to each other. And I don't think that my way is the only way, by the way. I think that it's an invitation for us to pay more attention to silence in its various forms and to find other methodologies for also doing so. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lisa. I'm a linguistic anthropologist, so I'm very sympathetic to everything you're just saying. And I just was very interested listening to what you were just answering to China about the idea of the family as like the ethnographic object of study, and the relationship in your own work back to dinner time conversation. And it's kind of a little insight for me that like that, analysis of the mealtime setting as a handy sort of methodological, like research vehicle, right? It could take you into studies of attitudes about cultural attitudes about food or something like that, but actually thinking of that as, the mealtime is the epicenter of the kitchen, which is the epicenter of the house and the household. And there's not really a question in that, but I think that I see this as a kind of natural extension. So, the deathbed is like the mealtime in a way, right? It is very much parallel as a site and setting for, this is sort of a methodological just observation, but I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that another thing to at the same time keep in mind is that not all cultures center the family meal or meal time as the time to be social. Like there's some places where you're actually supposed to be eating in silence or to each be eating alone. And that's part of sometimes what happens in the US, although we have this kind of ideal of the family mealtime, and then we have all of our plethora of choices and everything. And so that's something that as a methodology I think is really, really productive, is to follow food, because food is so central to our sociality. And meals are one way of getting at this, and I think, again, is a way of also getting at silences. So thank you so much for bringing that up. And I think that for me, that kind of grew from my earliest study, which was on eating disorders, and then looking at family meal times. And one of my mistakes in Vietnam was that I thought I wanted to film meals, and I always found it impossible because they wanted me to sit down and eat with them, and it was impossible to not do that. And my mistake ethnographically, that is something that I would do differently today, is to say, you know what, fine, I'll put the camera on a tripod and participate and feel comfortable being part of the meal instead of being the observer. And I regret not having done that because, I'm not comfortable being on camera, and that's not fair. So that is absolutely something that I think is troublesome in our methodology sometimes, is that it's more fun to be the observer than be observed.
Thank you for sharing the stories about Vietnam. I'm from Vietnam.
Cool.
So, it's very interesting to see how you approach to that. It was from the more like interpersonal, and also maybe also a lot from ethnic approach. But one of the things I love to see more is like from cultural or even Vietnam is thousands of years under kind of attached to the Chinese culture, including Confucianism. Right? So that explains a lot of values for communities, values of family, collective kind of approach. Then that you can see that how is they react in society, in the community, village, or even in the family. But one way to see that is also like the hierarchical or like seniority there. So see even that when the gender, we try to unpack how is gender day, what is the role of women, and we can still see that women can carry guns to the battle to do the work, but they still became very strong back up at home as a kind of spirit. But the sacrifice is there because they have to act as a dual roles. But they sacrifice themselves, even never said about their hardship or suffering. And even now in modern time, after the war, you can see that how they tend to be at the back, even providing case for family. So see that it's not most men doing that job.
Yeah. No,
It's
absolutely.
women. And yes, and then I see that maybe you can come all the way from cultural.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I agree with you 100%. And I think this is a matter of what to foreground and what to background. And so, for example, in another piece that I wrote on mourning and funeral rituals, I take on more fully the fact that the subjectivity of present Vietnam is not divorced from its history. It's not like, oh, we just now have a new socialist self, right? Like it's very much embedded and entwined within the history of Confucianism and also Buddhism. And that hierarchy is very much a kind of Confucian heritage. But that there is a little bit, that there is both kind of confluence of ways of doing things in the command economy as well as a contestation of it. So even though communism, for example, was supposed to be erasing feudalism, right? And as if to disavow the Confucian past, the residues of that continue to pervade social relations, exactly like you said. And so on the one hand, there's this idea, and I think that people really do take it seriously, the asymmetrical reciprocity, that you do yield to those below, that you're supposed to provide, and that's part of also redistributing wealth, right? And at the same time, the hierarchy still exists, right? And women are in many ways expected to be subservient to men, even as they're oftentimes actually making more money and contributing more to the household economy. And there's a tension in these values, right? And so you're right, I could have done a much more kind of Vietnam culturalist talk in which I would try to tease out some of these values. And I do try to do a bit more of that in the book. For example, in chapter 5, a bit more in chapter 2, and definitely 3. But you're right, that it's everything you say completely resonates in terms of these different hierarchies. But at the same time, I will say that those gender hierarchies continue to also be cross-cut by both the class hierarchies and the political hierarchies, at least in central Vietnam, because so many families were split. And one of the things that motivated this study was, how is it that families that literally had brothers fighting on opposing sides of the war, you had some families where they went north to join the revolution, like Pan had done. And then he came back, and his youngest brother was in re-education camp, right? And his wife is telling me that her favorite person was her sister-in-law, whose husband was in re-education camp, and she actually found a kind of kinship and affiliation with her because both were separated from their husbands for so long. And she was also very much an outsider to the central Vietnam community. And part of that, because she's a northerner, and part of it was because she didn't want to give money to them. And her husband would go behind her back and give money to his relatives. And so I think those cultural values that you speak about very much continue to not only pervade but guide social life, and inform social life, obviously, even as there is all of this social change. And that's why I ended up latching on to sacrifice, Hussein and Vietnam as ways of understanding this. Like, how is it that we have so much seeming continuity in the face of change, and how these continue to be in tension with each other?
Yeah, thank you for the great talk. I'm a Chinese person. I mean the cave you showed and the silent everyday sacrifice you talk about is definitely resonating with my living experience in a small village in North China, and many things I observe, about my fellow villagers in that small place. So I would say the silent everyday sacrifice really give me a new perspective to interpret a lot of things in China, which is significant and very helpful. One thing I want to ask is about like the longitudinal view of the asymmetrical reciprocity, because Vietnam is going through a process of reform, economic openness and reform. And as you mentioned in the book, you and I joined the World Economy Organization in 2005.
Yeah.
2005.
But officially 2007, I think. Like Bush came and it was the whole thing. Yeah.
So and I guess there is kind of domestic migration process going on also in Vietnam. So I wonder how the asymmetrical reciprocity relationship may be changed by all kinds of socio-political factors in the last 2 or 3 decades.
I think that's a great question, and I think that this is where it really behooves us to go back again and again, because I know that even as I was doing the research in Da Nang, my friend Alan Tran was doing work in Ho Chi Minh City, in Saigon, and he was observing like somewhat really different ways of engaging in courtship and marriage, betrayal, and that kind of thing. And I think some of it has to do a bit with our focus. I was focusing on family life and on where things cohere, and at the same time, don't think that there was no affairs, among the families I studied. There was absolutely cheating and adultery and all that. It didn't happen to be what I focused on, right? But as far as even dating and how it's done, there are changes. He also, because he's gone again and again in ways that I haven't been able to go again and again, was seeing even how talk of the emotions in Vietnam changed over time, from less thematizing of emotions as a thing to talk about to much more kind of being a subject of talk. And then I guess the other thing that has been changing, not changing, I think speaks a bit more again to your question, which is that on the one hand, Vietnam really, has so much of its cultural traditions from China. It was occupied by China for 1,000 years, right? Also, lots of hate against China, right? Lots of hostility, and people would say, can you please bring me a computer, but not one made in China. It's really hard, because, and all kinds of things about kind of an anti-Chinese sentiment. At the same time, that even in thinking about language, some of the grammar of Vietnamese and Chinese is different. And people, even though you've been speaking this language for hundreds of years, they will tell me, oh, this is Chinese roots, and this is indigenous Vietnamese, right? And some of it has to do with the word order of adjective noun, but some of it is also even just kind of how we say 1, 2, 3, first, second, third. You have, the kind of Chinese root and the non-Chinese root, which is not to your question, but more about the ways that these cultural values continue to be contested, conflicted, and at the same time that there is continuity, it's not stagnant. and that there was a lot of effort made to remember certain things and to kind of silence other things. And what is it that you want to remember or not remember, right? Would you continue or not continue? And so in the funeral piece, we don't actually see it in this slide, but even that when somebody dies, they would hang all of these banners and flyers and stuff. And I put this slide because the article is where it talks about it, and it's not in the book. But so they, the traditional language or the traditional script came from China, right? And then you have the Vietnamese version of it, and which is an elaboration on the Chinese ideographs. But in any case, outside the home, they use the Romanized script exclusively. Inside the home, they still had all of these banners in Chinese and in the Romanized script, but made to look like the calligraphic Vietnamese Chinese, right? And I think that speaks not only to kind of a structural differentiation that people make between inside and outside the home, but also about the identity of the person as a kind of virtuous citizen and an enduring kin. And so a lot of times these linguistic practices help us see certain embedded ideas of culture that people are not going to be able to necessarily explain in an interview. And again, that's my plea for doing more ethnography, and I think the more you can do that kind of longitudinal work, the better. And so I had kind of a limited privilege of going between 2002 and 2008 and seeing change happen as I went along, right? That trees were raised to the ground, houses were raised to the ground. Suddenly all of the pit toilets no longer existed, and you did have the flushing toilets. But in a lot of houses in the city where you couldn't just rebuild everything, so people had cell phones and the pit toilet. And it was such a small space that they hung the bicycle above that, pit toilet and that kind of thing. And so you see kind of the change through material culture as well as through people's behaviors and ideologies. And I'm sure that had I gone back as I was leaving one of the families I was following, their house was scheduled to be erased because they were going to build a new bridge in the city. And I think I have a photo of that bridge, which I haven't visited. But in any case, it's just to agree with you that the longitudinal probably would document more change than maybe I'm narrating here.
Yeah, I was very much intrigued by the kids, who were taught to say goodbye to people, because I used to be that kid in my village, and I never grasped the skill very well. I've always been taught to greet people, to call all the villagers in the relative terms.
Yeah.
It's a huge village with 1,000 residents.
Yeah.
You call them aunts, second aunts, seventh aunts. It's so difficult to do that. I mean, it's a lifelong experience of socializing and being a moral person, doing the personhood. It's a lifelong process.
It is, and it's difficult, and sometimes some people are held to a higher standard than others, right? Some people have to attend these ritual celebrations more than others, and I think that sometimes that has to do with a purse string, right? And you kind of get a pass. If you can send money, okay, maybe you don't have to visit so much, right? I mean, people would complain about, oh my God, I have to go to another ancestor ritual thing. And so as long as there was somebody coming, they did that. And the two, I lived with a host family where the university that I was affiliated with, they set me up with this family, and I was like, that's fine, like that takes the pressure off of me to make a decision about which family I stay with, because by the time I came for the dissertation, everybody wanted me to live with them because they wanted an in-home tutor in English, right? And so I was like, hey, I'll live where the gravity determined to. But they saw themselves as modern, and because it was just two girls, and they were in their 20s, they didn't call each other older sister, younger sister, like most families did. But they explicitly framed themselves as like, no, we are not, the old traditional way. But everybody else in their kinship group did use all of these kinship terms. And when it came to the ancestor worship rituals, the feasts and everything, they still did many of these practices. And so I think instead of thinking of it in dichotomous terms as either traditional or modern, that it's a lot more entwined.